share my screen here. Moment. Alrighty. So again, welcome to Wildlife Wednesday. We'll be learning more on the presentation titled Connecting the Dots, Alaska's Migratory Shorebirds with Dan Ruthrauff. Some virtual engagement guidelines tonight. I encourage that you keep your mute off and your mute on and your video off. And what that'll do is help minimize distractions for our presenter. And I do encourage you to watch the presentation in full screen mode. That'll help make sure that you're seeing all the videos and photographs that are being shared. And if you have any sort of questions throughout the presentation, please do throw it into the chat and we'll get to everything in the last 10 to 15 minutes of the presentation this evening. So we will get to them towards the end. And overall, I just hope you have a good time and that you learn something new and that you share it with someone you know. If you are a member with the Alaska Wildlife Alliance, I want to give a special thank you tonight because you make these presentations free for the public. So thank you very much for your support towards our programming. And we've been around since the 70s doing work, making sure that wildlife are being scientifically and ethically managed in the state of Alaska. And we solely do work in Alaska. We have 3 pillars of work that we focus on, and we work on citizen science. Currently, we're helping monitor for the critically endangered cook inlet beluga whales that are in the inlet. So if you're interested in volunteering to monitor those until May, you can do so at akbmp.org. We are part of that partnership. We're also helping with monitoring beach seabirds. There's been a beach seabird event. So if you're interested in helping out with that as a citizen scientist, you can visit our website or COAST's website, COASST. We also do education events. Maybe you've seen our posters in Juneau on the electric bus system, encouraging some bear aware behaviors. And we also attend tabling events. We do wildlife walks. We really just work to connect with the public when we can. COVID dependently, of course. And we also have quite a bit of advocacy. That's kind of our bread and butter where we originated from in the past. We just filed proposal 199. We went to the Board of Game this past spring, and that unfortunately did not pass, but it was requesting 50-yard setbacks on popular trails in the Matsu. To make sure that recreationalists weren't overlapping with traps in a dangerous manner. And unfortunately it didn't pass, but that is not the end of the saga. It'll continue on. So if you're interested in learning more on the work we're doing for that, you can sign up for our newsletter online or follow us on social media. But we want to say thank you to everyone who commented because we had close to 500 comments in support of that. And so it was truly a community effort. So thank you. And in this past fall, we filed a lawsuit to help better protect Beaufort Sea polar bears from harassment. So that's just a sampling of some advocacy we've been doing in recent months. And if you're interested in hearing more, we've been popping up in the news lately because of our proposal and kind of has been bringing up quite a bit of conversation on traps near trails. So we've been in the news on that a bit. And we also have some more lighthearted notes like a species spotlight on the meadow vole came out recently. And we also have more information on how you can help monitor for beluga whales. So quite a span of information. If you're interested in learning more, please visit our website. Some upcoming events. We have these Wildlife Wednesdays, just one more in this month of April, and then we will be taking a break, but shifting into wildlife walks, which will be happening this summer. So bears, birds, and beers. We meet up at a local brewery after we go for a wildlife walk. So if you're interested in learning more, again, you can visit our website, sign up for our newsletter, or follow us on social media. And spring monitoring for beluga whales, as I mentioned, akbnp.org. And next week we'll be in Homer at the Kachemak Bay Marine Mammal Forum. So we're bringing that to Homer to help educate folks on being aware of marine mammals, learning more, how they can become whale scent certified, and just generally celebrating. So check out our website for that if you're interested. I'll throw the link to that specifically in the chat, but we'll be happy to see you either in person or virtually. And our Wildlife Wednesdays are online on our Facebook and on our YouTube if you want to watch past ones. And we also have past recordings of our climate adaptation workshop that occurred in February. So lots of information on our website. Again, thank you to our members. And if you would like to support Alaska's wildlife and some of the work that AWA is doing specifically, you can visit that link there. I'll throw it into the chat once I'm done. And you can also support us in additional ways below. That's just financially, but if you're also interested in volunteering, please reach out. We have opportunities, especially coming up this summer with tabling, and we'd be happy to have you. But thank you to those who are members tonight, making these Wildlife Wednesdays free. And I will hand it off to Dan. Thank you so much for your time, and we're looking forward to hearing more on shorebirds.
All right. How's that look? You see my screen?
Perfect. Yep.
Well, thank you, Kelsey. Yeah, as Kelsey said, my name is Dan Ruthrauff, and I'm a wildlife biologist with the U.S. Geological Survey here in Anchorage, Alaska, and I'm going to talk about work that I've been involved with, along with a bunch of other folks studying the migration ecology of Alaska's shorebirds, and specifically some of the conservation insights that we've gained from this work over the years. And the dramatic pause for the first slide to advance. That sometimes happens. Even more dramatic. Come on, PowerPoint. There we go. So before I start, I just want to thank all the people that I've worked with over many, many years that have made this happen. I'm presenting a lot of work that I may not have even been involved with, but it's just fun stories about Alaska's shorebirds. And I've had the good fortune to interact with a ton of really capable and motivated folks over the years who are passionate about shorebirds. So I'm happy to share the work of all of us tonight. And so to start at the very beginning, what is a shorebird? Just so we're all on the same page, there are many birds that use shorelines, like you see in this picture here, murres and puffins and herons and egrets. But what I'm talking about tonight are a specific group of birds that have a shared genetic lineage and shared natural history traits. And this is what we call shorebirds. And what I mean by shorebirds are birds like sandpipers, like the stilt sandpiper. I mean birds like curlews and godwits, like this whimbrel pictured here. Plovers, this nice black-bellied plover, phalaropes, oyster catchers, and turnstones. And this is what I mean by shorebirds. And in Alaska, just almost by definition, shorebirds have a high latitude distribution. Alaska is a high latitude region, and so these birds are almost always migratory. That there are a handful of birds that are shorebirds that don't migrate, but the vast majority are migratory. And that's the story I'm going to share with you tonight. So why study shorebirds? Well, I think they're beautiful, and I think they do amazing things. They're charismatic. They do some weird things, like the rock sandpipers in this picture, who choose not to migrate and spend their winters here in Cook Inlet. There are lots of wonderful reasons to study birds, just for scientific and natural historical reasons, and just for their beauty. But unfortunately, there's other reasons to study shorebirds that are a little more dire. And there's been a lot of recent publicity about this paper that came out recently. It's kind of colloquial, called 3 billion birds, and that it describes the loss to the North American avifauna. Nearly 30% of birds that were present in 1970 are now gone, and shorebirds constitute a large proportion of those. That the study demonstrated that about 17 million shorebirds have been lost since 1970, representing a 37% overall decline in shorebird numbers in North America, and that this affects almost all the species. That about 70% of the shorebird species are in decline over the last 50 years. So there are a lot of really good conservation related reasons to study shorebirds as well. And in Alaska, we really need to study shorebirds because it's really one of the world's hotspots. It's really the hub of 5 migratory flyways that converge up here in Alaska, which is really unique when you consider that there's only 10 flyways in the whole world. That Alaska gets birds from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from really all over the globe. And because of that, we support millions and millions of individuals from over 40 species that come up here to breed. So there are lots of good reasons to study shorebirds and even more good reasons to study them in Alaska. So shorebirds aren't very large. As you can tell by some of these pictures, they're not really large birds. So how do we track them? Well, it's really been a very recent event that we're able to track them because the technology has finally got to the point where radios are small enough that we can track these birds. So what you see in this picture are colleagues holding a marbled godwit that we have just affixed a transmitter to. And these transmitters, the ones that we typically deploy, they communicate the bird's location via satellites, and those satellites talk to us at our computers in our offices. And so we're able to deploy these small devices that are now as small as like 1 or 2 grams. So you can track very, very small birds, and they relay the location of these birds. We're attaching these radios externally, and we find that once we release the birds, they typically preen the harness that goes around the legs of the birds. They preen the feathers over that. You can't hardly even see it. And these are solar powered radios. And when these birds fly, they charge well enough that they relay the locations. And pretty much all you see when these birds are flying is this little antenna like you see on this wimbrel. So we know that's asking a lot of these birds to put a little, gadget on their back. It's like putting a big backpack on me and expecting me to wear it the rest of my life. But we hope that, the gains, the knowledge gains outweigh the impact on any individual bird. So I'll start with this image, which came from a recent paper that we, colleagues and I published about shorebird migration in the Pacific Basin. And what you'll see throughout this talk tonight are a lot of little dots just like this. And sometimes those dots will be connected by little lines, and those just represent the location of birds as they move throughout their range. And what you see here is just sort of these amazing dots crossing the Pacific, all up and down both sides of the Pacific, everywhere. And it starts to give you a sense that really, it's not surprising, but the sky is full of birds. And the magic of tracking some of these birds on migration just starts to make it a little more real. So this image I showed just to kind of drive home that there's birds moving all around the globe all the time. But more than sort of those gee whiz facts, I want to talk about some of the real conservation lessons that we've learned by these tracking efforts. So with that in mind, the first example I'll talk to you tonight about is one of the most renowned shorebird migrants, the bar-tailed godwit. And this involves a story of habitat loss. So bar-tailed godwits have a whole Arctic distribution. They breed pretty much all around the globe in high latitude regions in the Arctic. There's 5 subspecies, and there's 3 subspecies in the Pacific. And before we had these nice small radios, the way that most researchers track the movements of birds was by deploying these uniquely colored leg bands. So you can see this image on the right. There's a bar-tailed godwit with yellow and red and blue and white bands, and that's a unique combination that uniquely identifies that bird. And it was captured in New Zealand in the winter by Phil Batley. And Shazam, it was seen later that spring in the Yellow Sea. You can see in the image on the right where the bird has considerably more breeding plumage. So this is how researchers used to track the movement of birds. And that's great when these birds go to places where people occur, like New Zealand and the Yellow Sea. But the problem with birds like bar-tailed godwits is that they breed in areas where there are almost no humans to recite them. So the distribution of these 3 subspecies within the Pacific region was really poorly understood until colleagues started to track their migration. So this is images from a paper where we tracked godwits by equipping them with these satellite transmitters at sites in New Zealand and also in Western Australia. And you can see that in their first migration north, both populations head to, within that black box is the Yellow Sea. And the birds from New Zealand fly about 6,000 miles nonstop. Those from Australia, nearly 4,000 miles nonstop. They both spend a considerable amount of time in the Yellow Sea recuperating from that long migration. And then they continue on to breeding grounds. And this was kind of the eye-opening part that color banding didn't tell us, that the birds from Australia breed in Russia, while the birds from New Zealand breed in Alaska. And they're making these long epic flights to get to these areas. And just like Alaska, the Yellow Sea is an incredible hub of migratory birds. That it's also the most threatened flyway. It supports the most threatened flyway in the world, the East Asia Australasia flyway. There are 20 populations of 17 shorebird species that face extinction risk. And it attracts birds because it's this incredibly rich ecosystem full of wetlands and rivers that create a rich ecosystem, but it's under considerable pressure from human growth. And so that these birds use this region was well known, but where the birds went after they left the LOC was poorly known until this tracking study. And then this was sort of the jaw-dropping migration that you may be familiar with about the bar-tailed godwits, that the godwits that breed in Alaska stage at sites on the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta in the fall, and then they conduct these nonstop flights from Alaska to New Zealand. You know, these migrations are about 7,500 miles nonstop, usually like 8 or 9 days of constant flapping flight. These birds don't soar. So this is the longest known nonstop migration in the bird world. Pretty amazing. In contrast, the birds that breed in Russia go back again to the Yellow Sea. They don't make a nonstop flight. They go and stage in the Yellow Sea again before then continuing on to sites in Western Australia. So these round trip migrations for the birds from New Zealand is about 20,000 miles and about 14,000 miles for the birds from Australia. So that was really eye-opening and phenomenal, but it also really helped elucidate some real conservation threats that by virtue of these color bands that people have applied to these birds, you can recite these birds each year over and over at their non-breeding sites, and you can tell who's living and who's not living. And what this figure shows, the colleagues looked at these survival rates based on color bands, and the birds in the black figures, those are the birds that breed in Alaska that only go to the Yellow Sea once in the springtime. And you can see their population survival rates have declined over this period of study from 2005 to 2013, but not nearly so dramatically as the birds that breed in Russia and visit the Yellow Sea both during spring and fall migration. So by virtue of going through the Yellow Sea, these birds were suffering higher or lower survival rates. And this is because the Yellow Sea is really an ecological disaster, that over 65% of the tidal flats in the region that support birds like bar-tailed godwits have been lost over the last 50 years. And so by virtue of tracking these populations, it helped elucidate the potential impact of all these habitat losses. This is a really sad picture that a colleague took in the Yellow Sea of a mudflat being pumped dry while migratory bar-tailed godwits are staging, getting ready to move north to the breeding grounds. I'm happy to say that the rate of wetland loss in China has greatly subsided, that the Chinese government has enacted a lot of recent reforms to slow this down, but it's still a really dire situation. And it wasn't until people were able to track these birds that they really started to be able to really get the smoking gun. I mean, we kind of knew that this was probably a big problem, but it took tracking to really demonstrate the effect on these two populations. So that's kind of a sad, depressing story. Let's follow it up with a more interesting, uplifting story. Maybe not more interesting, but uplifting for sure, that focuses on a unique species of bristletide curlew, and that regards habitat restoration efforts and how these birds have responded to wetland restoration in Oahu. So on the left is an image of their breeding range in Alaska. They breed only in two really disjunct points, one in the Nulato Hills region of the Yukon Delta, the other in the Central Seward Peninsula. So they have these two discrete populations breeding in Alaska, but they scatter all across the entire Pacific Ocean. So the image on the right shows their non-breeding range all across the Central Pacific region. So really wide non-breeding distribution, very small breeding distribution, restricted only to Alaska. And where these birds typically spend the winter in the South Pacific are places like this, these beautiful atolls like the Tuamotu archipelago. And what these sites look like on the ground are pretty idyllic. And they're idyllic for these birds for many reasons, but the biggest draw for these birds is that there's really no disturbance and no predators historically on these atolls, that there were no humans there and they could go there and go about their business during the non-breeding season. And for curlews, this meant that their business included a very unusual wing molt, that shorebirds are birds of the air and they rely on flying, and that flight capability helps them evade predators. But because curlews evolved on these non-breeding islands with no predators, they evolved a molt that was very rapid and they dropped many feathers at once to the point where some of them actually go flightless, which makes them very vulnerable. And they're one of just 2 shorebird species in the world that undergoes a flightless molt. And this is a picture of birds that we caught in Oahu that was undergoing very heavy molt and could barely fly. And the trouble, if you can't fly, is that a lot of these atolls throughout the South Pacific are predicted to be subject to more and more inundation as sea levels rise. And if you can't fly, yes, you can climb a tree, but that's not a good stopgap measure. So it potentially makes bristle-like curlews really vulnerable to threats due to sea level rise. So my colleague Lee Tibbetts initiated a study at a very small wildlife refuge on the island of Oahu in Hawaii, the James Campbell National Wildlife Refuge. And this is teeny, teeny, tiny. It was established in 1976, and this refuge you can see in the image on the left, outlined in red, is only about 1.5 square miles big. So it's incredibly small. And it was created to restore and improve wetlands, specifically to support endangered Hawaiian water birds like the Hawaiian coot and the Hawaiian stilt. And so what the refuge managers did, this used to be settling ponds for a sugarcane operation before it became a refuge in 1976. And those settling ponds, they fenced them off with predator-proof fences and
So I think we lost Dan, but I would encourage you, I'm sure he's aware that he got kicked off. So if it's all right with you, I would encourage a quick water break, bio break, and I'm sure he'll be back in just a moment. So it might just be a brief pause for the evening, but I'm sure we'll get him back. So thank you for your patience, but I have a feeling he'll be back in a bit. So stay tuned. Thank you, everyone.
I'm back. Can people see me? That super unfortunate timing.
We are not in a rush. We're happy you're back. Just as
I
things
wasn't,
were heating up with
I know,
the birds on the
the-
fences.
letting the excitement build.
Yeah.
Is this where I fizzed out?
Yep. If you don't mind picking up at that point, and you can do a brief recap of where
Sure.
that is, but
Boom, they put up predator-proof fences around the refuge here, again, with the intention of protecting these Hawaiian water birds. But the bristle-like curlews responded. They like to roost on these fences. And they also enacted activities like trapping invasive predators, like this cute little puppy, and less cute animals like rats and feral pigs and cats and mongoose. And what the refuge staff started to notice is that, hey, bristle-like curlews, who we've never seen here before, are starting to show up. So this started in the late 1990s, and this figure goes through 2010, but the numbers increased pretty dramatically to the point that my colleague Lee Tibbetts, the work that she did, estimated a total of 126 birds using this refuge by 2014. And that's not a whole ton of birds, but it's actually quite a bit. It's about 1% of the breeding population of bristle-like curlews. So these birds that weren't using the island of Oahu at all, essentially responded to this teeny tiny little managed wetland that was predator-free, where they could go and molt without fear. And so where does tracking the migration of these birds come in? Well, Lee put satellite transmitters on these birds and found out how birds use the region, including using these nearby horse pastures. And more importantly, figured out things like how the birds are using the refuge during the day. You can see those locations in the left, day locations, scattered all over the refuge, whereas at the night, they're only within the refuge boundary, that part of the refuge that is within the predator-proof fence. And more specifically, those birds are roosting in a big lake with islands where they can be absolutely scot-free from predators. So the radio tracking demonstrated the importance of their predator-proof fencing efforts. It also really curiously found that a lot of these birds were making some inter-island movements to other islands within the Hawaiian Islands, that birds from Oahu went to Molokai, the big island of Hawaii, Nihoa, Nihau, and they were exploring. We don't really know what they were doing, but they were making reconnaissance trips. And it's easy to suspect that these birds are just looking for new habitats where they might also find predator-free environments. That undoubtedly bristle-like curlews used to be in the Hawaiian Islands, but since things have changed, since humans have arrived there with lots of introduced predators, it's become an unsafe place for them. And we also, by tracking these birds back and forth on their migrations to Alaska, found that these birds use an incredible diverse number of routes to and from Alaska, that you'd think that this is about as close as a bristle-like curlew can spend the non-breeding season to breeding sites in Alaska. And you'd think that might mean a pretty direct line between Alaska and Oahu, but that wasn't the case. These birds were making really amazing, wide, varying migrations, but they always ended up back at Oahu. So this is what we learned from tracking these birds and their migrations and how they're responding to this habitat restoration. The next story I'll share with you concerns marbled godwits, another really interesting species that breeds in Alaska, and how just sort of a really simple, straightforward study, or so we thought, tracking the migration of these birds led us to the discovery of a really unknown site here in Alaska. So marbled godwits, there are two subspecies with 3 breeding populations. There's one here in the Central Plains region of like Manitoba, Alberta, region of Canada, and North Dakota, the Dakotas, Great Plains of the Central Americas. Then there's this small population in Hudson Bay of Canada. And then way over here near the village of Ugashik on the Alaska Peninsula, it's this teeny tiny population that essentially doesn't even show up on the range map because it's a small population of only about 2,000 birds. And we wanted to study the migration of these birds. And you'll see hopefully an animation moving here from some of the work that we did. And the birds moved across. Maybe you saw those dots over on the Alaska Peninsula, and then they made nonstop flights across the Gulf of Alaska. And now you can see the months ticking away in the upper corner of this animation. And in January, in the winter season, these birds were distributed from basically the central Washington coast to about the Monterey region of California. And then in the spring, you see all those dots. they're moving up the coast of Alaska back to their breeding site in Ugashik, where they spend a relatively short amount of time, and again, making their migrations across the Gulf of Alaska back to their non-breeding sites. So these birds are really stationary and site faithful to their non-breeding sites and their breeding sites. When they're at their non-breeding sites, they hardly move around at all and wait for spring again to move up the coast and breed at the Ugashik region of the Alaska Peninsula. And so one of the things that was really interesting about these migrations was that there was a site called Controller Bay in eastern Prince William Sound that was really unknown to ornithologists. There's been some work done there in the past, but the importance of this site to marbled godwits was completely unappreciated. And it's on the larger Copper River Delta system, which is widely recognized as one of the most important migratory stopover sites for shorebirds in the world, really. And so I think in some ways, Controller Bay was sort of overlooked, that it was just a little bit further away from Cordova and tougher to get to. And there were so many birds of the Copper River Delta proper that the use of Controller Bay region was unknown by marbled godwits until this radio tracking happened. And what we found, we only tagged about 10 birds, and we tracked 6 of those birds on spring migrations, and all 6 of those birds visited Controller Bay. And we tracked birds on repeat migrations. So these birds made repeated movements across many, many years. And on 14 of 17 spring migrations that we tracked, birds used Controller Bay. So it was used by all the birds on almost every single migration as they made their way north to breeding sites. And in contrast, it was never used during fall migration. Like that animation showed, they make nonstop flights across the Gulf of Alaska back to their non-breeding sites. So a very important site for these birds. This was totally unknown until we stuck radios on. And so now the question is, what's so important about Controller Bay? I'm working with a colleague at the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, Janelle Larson-Temple, who's doing a study there to understand exactly why this spot is so important to these birds. And she got on the ground there last spring, and this is what it looks like, which isn't too different from other sites in Alaska. And undoubtedly the birds are stopping there to refuel. And this is a picture of a core sample that she sieved out on the sand flats there. And I've circled in red these teeny tiny little clams. They're called Lamecula baltica is the scientific name. The Baltic talon, they're just teeny tiny little clams that we don't really ever notice, but these shorebirds very much notice that they're very, very high quality food source for these birds. And so the marbled godwits are undoubtedly stopping there and fueling on their migrations before heading to the breeding grounds. And it turns out, by talking to other colleagues who track red knots, like in that picture in the upper right of your screen, and Hudsonian godwits perching in the tree on the lower right of your screen, those are 2 species of high conservation concern. And colleagues who track those birds have also found that for whatever reason, they're also stopping in really high numbers in Controller Bay during the spring. And this is important because this was totally unknown until we started tracking these shorebirds. And the state of Alaska, there are large subsurface coal deposits in the region, and there have been various efforts over the years to develop those coal reserves. And it was also the site of one of the first oil discoveries in Alaska at Katala. And there's a lot of timber resources there. So the area has a lot of interest for natural resource extraction. And so there's a lot of effort now to understand why it's so important to these shorebirds of high conservation concern. And my last example, some of the results of our migratory tracking involves the whimbrel. And the results of our study of the movements of whimbrel really highlighted some of the behavioral diversity that some of these migrants exhibit. Some shorebirds do, they all act very similar, like Western sandpipers can reliably be found on the Copper River Delta in the spring, that almost the entire population will gather there. But other birds like whimbrel, they scatter during their migrations. And this was a big takeaway for us when we studied their migratory movements. We conducted this study at a couple of different sites. We studied them up on the north slope of Alaska on the Colva River Delta, and also in a boreal site on Canooting National Wildlife Refuge. So really different populations, hundreds of miles away. And again, you'll see a migration here, the animation in this figure, and we're in the winter period, and you see these dots, birds down in Mexico, Chile, and now spring migration is happening, and they're winding their way up north, moving up the coast of North America to their breeding sites in Canooty and Colville Delta. Now that it's fall migration, they're moving out to the western Alaska, Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, moving down the coast. And you can see their migrations take a long time. You have birds in Mexico who are still trickling down south in January down to their non-breeding locations. So long protracted migrations over a very long, wide non-breeding range, but all in a relatively discrete breeding area within Alaska. You see them all going up to their breeding sites in Alaska, very tight range, but then scattering back to their non-breeding sites over a huge range. So this was really interesting for us to see. And in total, we tracked 32 birds over 2006 to 2015 and included repeat migrations for many birds. And some of the really interesting takeaways were that birds from Alaska visited all sites with any shoreline on the Pacific coastline in North, Central, or South America. So every country that had any Pacific coastline, these birds were there. And they wintered in Mexico, Honduras, Costa Rica, Panama, Colombia, Ecuador, and Chile. So all up and down from northern Mexico to the southern tip of Chile. And this was a huge non-breeding range. It spanned almost 70 degrees of latitude and nearly 5,300 miles. So these birds that are down in Chile are making considerably longer migrations over a much longer period of time than those that stay in Mexico. And they're encountering really different habitats in those sites. Like this is a picture from Bahía de Lobos in Sonora, Mexico, essentially a tropical wetland mudflat that these whimbrel are using. Whereas down in southern Chile on Chiloé Island, they're in habitats that look much more akin to like Prince William Sound. So they're encountering a lot of habitats along the way. And this was exhibited by our tracking as well, that these birds are using mangrove habitats, they visiting aquaculture ponds, both shrimp and fish ponds, all up and down the Pacific Flyway, intertidal mudflats. And one really interesting thing that we found from our tracking was that these birds had a real affinity for these mixed agriculture zones, like in the Imperial Valley and the Central Valley of California, and at sites throughout Mexico. And I'll show this in a little more detail with sort of the star of our show. This was this bird with this leg flag T6. And this was a bird that we tracked over 5 years. So we got a lot of really interesting information on how these birds make some repeat movements and how they use sites throughout their migration. And T6 would usually spend about 100 days each year during its fall migration, moving between its breeding grounds on the Colville River Delta and its non-breeding sites in central Chile. And its spring migration would take about 60 days each year. But we found that it really relied on agriculture lands. That I should go back. This figure here, you see in the image on the left, some highlights in the yellow triangles. And these were sites that T6 habitually visited almost every year on every migratory trip, south or north. These were sites like the Selawik River Valley, the Kuskokwim River Valley, Central Valley in California, a site in Mexico, a site in Peru. It otherwise visited many sites, but without any real affinity, that it would stop in some sites in some years and not in others. But those sites in the yellow triangles on the left were always visited. And it turned out that this bird always visited these sites prior to very long migrations. And by long migrations, we made our cutoff those that spanned at least 3 days of nonstop movement. And this is an image taken from Google Earth that shows one such site that this bird T6 loved using agricultural lands near Guasave, Mexico. And it used these on 5 of 5 southbound migrations. So it very reliably went to these agricultural fields, don't really know what it was feeding on there, what it was doing there, but it found something that it liked every single southbound migration. And it would spend about a month there, and it would use this prior to conducting long nonstop flights to South America. So it showed really high fidelity to a handful of sites and very low fidelity to many other sites scattered around. And it also had interesting patterns when these birds when T6 would come north. This is an image of Cook Inlet, and this bird used sites in the Matsu Valley on 4 of 5 northbound migrations. And again, these were used sort of to recover from long flights. This bird would always arrive here after a direct flight from the Central Valley of California. And when we started to look at some of these, like in Mexico, these birds were using croplands that we assumed were either fallow or I don't really know what they look like. But one year in May of 2015, my colleague Lee Tibbetts, we got hits that this bird T6 was over near Point McKenzie, which was accessible by road. And she drove over there and she found it feeding in these ag fields, these grasslands. So these are kind of birds of the grasslands and looking for sort of pseudo-agricultural fields, be it in Alaska or Mexico throughout their annual voyage. So tracking whimbrels, we found that they have an incredibly wide non-breeding range. Those whimbrels that breed in Alaska scatter over a huge non-breeding range, and they show relatively little connectivity between their breeding sites and their non-breeding sites, that birds from Canute Refuge didn't all, for instance, stay more north in the non-breeding range, while Colville birds went further south. They were all scattered all throughout, so exhibited relative activity, and that these birds also had really dispersed migratory movements, that there is very little overlap among individuals. I mentioned like Western sandpipers all pretty much occurring on the Copper River Delta. Well, you're not going to find a place where all the whimbrels reliably occur. They are really scattered with their dispersed movements. And they exhibited, because of this wide non-breeding range, they had a real interesting diversity of behaviors, that the timing and the duration of their movements were very different between birds wintering further north and those further south. And they used a whole variety of habitats throughout these annual movements. And kind of the big takeaway from this, we were lucky enough to track enough individuals on multiple migratory movements, was that the population had a huge amount of variability, but that the individuals are very consistent. And this poses a lot of really interesting conservation challenges when you're trying to accommodate species with such diverse migratory movements. So I return back to this image that we sort of started with, where it's like all these gee whiz pictures of birds moving through the air, that really kind of stirs the imagination, just to think about all these birds moving all up and down throughout our terrestrial flyways, but then also flying over the ocean where there's no place to land, and they're committing to these long nonstop migrations. And so tracking these birds, you know, on kind of a real visceral level, just brought home the magic of migration to us, but it also really drove home some of the direct impacts that these birds are facing due to things like habitat loss and benefits of habitat restoration, the way that they might respond to that. And also uncovered some really new things for us. I mean, it's kind of unusual as biologists to really have anything, you know, jump out as new, but the use of controller bay was really news to us for so many important shorebird species like the marbled godwit. And finally, it really helped drive home that the diversity of migratory patterns exhibited by birds, not just like whimbrels, but taken in whole, all these birds that we've tracked, they're all doing such different things in such fascinating ways. Really so much to take away from these studies. So, you know, I've outlined some of the conservation threats that these birds are facing. How can we help shorebirds? Well, I think we're very, very lucky in Alaska that we're not suffering the effects like, say, the Yellow Sea region of China, that there's almost no reclamation of lands here in Alaska, that we're very fortunate to live in places where there's just tracts of pristine habitat. That's not to say that we're not suffering, say, the effects of climate change, for instance, but I think that we're very lucky that Alaska can serve as sort of a stronghold for these birds while they're trying to deal with these conservation threats outside of Alaska. And so we need to work to keep protecting these lands. So that simply means just thinking about shorebirds and their habitats and advocating for those spaces within Alaska. And really, I think we're also very lucky as Alaskans that these birds are facing their biggest threats outside of the state, that we can feel good about what we're doing here, but that doesn't mean that these birds are safe outside of Alaska. And I mean, we share these birds with the world, but they are breeding here in Alaska. And so I think we have a real obligation to also advocate for shorebirds and their habitats outside of Alaska. And that's very, very challenging. And when you're trying to stare down the Chinese government and in reclamation in the Yellow Sea, it can feel all kind of overwhelming, but there's so many good groups out there like Audubon Society, Cornell Lab of Ornithology, Alaska Wildlife Alliance, TNC, World Wildlife Fund. There are all sorts of great groups all throughout the world working to help conserve shorebirds and their habitats. So those are some of the things that I think we can hopefully stand behind to help these birds and their amazing migrations. And with that, I thank everybody for tuning in tonight on a nice sunny Wednesday evening. And I think all the folks who shared their beautiful pictures with me and shared their research experiences with me. And I'd be happy to take any questions if anyone has questions.
Thank you, Dan. My big question is why. I just seems like a lot to go down to Chile and then come back up for little clams that you like so much. It just is pretty impressive. And that's an understatement. But if anyone
Yeah.
has questions, you can throw them into the chat and we'll get to those if we can. And let's see here, we'll start. Someone asks, were you able to also track the altitude of curlews as they migrated from Hawa to Alaska? Are winds or jet streams affecting the non-direct migration routes that your map was showing?
Yeah, that's a really good question and something I didn't touch on, but unfortunately, we haven't been able to determine the elevation at which these birds are flying very well, but we do know they really do take advantage of the dominant weather patterns that Bartel Godwitz, my colleague, Bob Gill, he really led the work on Bartel Godwitz here in Alaska, and he did real esoteric studies involving meteorological models that demonstrate that these birds are taking off to take advantage of these great low pressure systems that cross the Gulf of Alaska every fall, that these birds have some sort of almost like a ability to predict the weather well offshore, because they're launching their migrations only under favorable conditions, such that they're hitting these low pressure systems maybe 3 days into their voyage. So we know that these birds have some amazing ability to detect these, maybe it's pressure differential, and they have phyloplumes that are really sensitive to pressure. Maybe it's in their sensory organs in their bill. There's all sorts of theories about how these birds do it, but the new generation of tracking devices, we can get at altitude at which these birds are flying. So that's an exciting new thing. But right now, all we know is that they're definitely taking advantage of these weather fronts as they make their movements. Yeah, they look for advantageous conditions.
Great, thank you. Someone asks, any idea why godwits don't take advantage of, and this is my uncultured way, it's spelled lime cola. It's probably
I've never thought of that.
much more beautifully.
They probably don't taste like lime cola. Yeah.
Why don't they take advantage of that on their southward migration?
And I'm sorry, this was for godwits?
Yes.
They do. That's a really good point, that the coast of the Yukon Delta has some of the highest densities of these clams in the world. These clams, lime cola, I like that. I'm gonna try and say lamicola, but I'll forever think of lime cola now. They occur around the world. They're called the Baltic telin because they occur in the Baltic Sea in Europe. And yeah, as part of my dissertation work, we looked at sort of differences in density and quality of these prey items here in Alaska and other parts of the world. And the densities and the quality, like the amount of flesh within the clam compared to the shell that protects it, really high quality clams here in Alaska and really high density. So on the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, where these bar-tailed godwits, almost all of them stage during migration, almost the entire population stages these few shoals off the mouth of the Kuskokwim, and they're out there eating these small clams. And they more than double their body mass in about 4 weeks to fuel their migration. So it's a very, very important fuel source for them, both spring and fall.
Wow. High quality clams here in Alaska. I love that.
Yeah.
All right. How do the birds manage to do week-long direct flights for about a week straight without presumably being able to hydrate or drink fresh water?
It's a good mystery of science. The boring answer, and this is a real answer, it's not totally boring, but they generate metabolic water by burning fat. You're right, they're not, some birds actually will drink while flying, like you can see terns and skimmers, and they'll dip their bills in the water and they can process the salt and consume the water, but yeah, godwits can't do that. And so what they're doing actually as they burn fat, just the physiology of that fat process, as those lipids are processed, it releases water. I can't explain it any better than that, but they stay hydrated by virtue of burning fat. It's pretty remarkable.
Wow, wow.
Yeah.
Their little bodies are working so hard.
Yep. So
We'll
they're
go
not
for,
drinking, they're not sleeping, they're just, yeah, it goes beyond a marathon for sure.
yeah, yeah. I will go for a few miles on a run and I'll be like, whoa, I am done for the
Yep.
day. And these sweet little birds. Okay. Another question, will Lime Cola habitat be subject to climate change related flooding in the YK Delta?
Yeah, that's
Temecula? Is that
Lamicula.
okay.
Yeah. We scratch our heads about that. We're not sure. There's been some nice research done on what's happening with coastal erosion on the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. Right now, it seems sort of like at places like the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, where there aren't seawalls, as the sea levels rise, it's going to reclaim terrestrial habitat and convert that into these mud flats. And so there isn't as big a concern as, say, in the Yellow Sea, where bar-tailed godwits stop in the spring and eating a different type of clam. There's no place as the sea levels rise for those habitats to expand. Because there's seawalls, like concrete dikes all throughout the Yellow Sea. So there's a real concern that in places that are really industrialized, this is going to be a big problem, that these mud flats are going to slowly disappear. Not only are they being reclaimed and there's iPhone factories being built on them, but as the sea levels rise, it's going to be harder and harder for these birds to access mud. Thankfully, that's less of a concern, although it is a concern in Alaska, like I say, because we don't have the seawalls at these places like the Yukon Delta. So we think that the Lamicula should do fine, but it's one of those natural experiments we don't really want to see happening.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, my mind's reeling. Good to know. I mean, I appreciate hearing that. Are birds consuming Lamicula, eating the shells too, or are they shelling the clams before they eat them?
Yeah, that's a great question, because there are shorebirds like oyster catchers that typically don't eat the shell. They use, like oyster catchers use their bill to cut the adductor muscle in large clams and mussels and just extract the flesh. But these guys, like I'll show another image here. Like this is a black-bellied plover eating Lamicula, and they eat them whole. And this was an acknowledgement slide from a previous presentation I gave. And they have a really muscular gizzard, and they crush the shells in that gizzard and pass it all through their digestive system. So it is a fair bit of work for these birds to eat these clams. And like I mentioned, for whatever reason, the shells in Alaska are relatively thin compared to shells in other regions that we've looked at, like in the Netherlands and Germany. We have some theories about that, like in Cook Inlet, the shells are especially thin, and these rock sandpipers that spend the winter here, the clams here are super high quality in Cook Inlet. And we think that maybe that's because there are relatively few predators for these clams, that the primary predators for these clams are small shrimps and crabs and things like that. And I think honestly, on these giant mudflats here in the winter, the shrimp and the crab don't want to be frozen, whereas these clams can retract into the mud. And so they don't have the natural defenses that they might have, say, in the Dutch Wadden Sea, where there are lots of crabs and lots of shrimp. That's just a wild theory that we would love to test more. But all we know is that it is hard work for these birds to crush these shells, but that the shells in Alaska are relatively thin compared to other places in the world. Yeah, which makes, Alaska all the more desirable for these birds.
That's wild. I didn't realize they were swallowing them whole.
Yeah.
I just keep thinking to the little Pixar short called Plover, where this little plover is like not eating them whole. And so I feel misled, but
Yep. Disney
wild.
doesn't always tell the truth.
Yeah, that's crazy. Wow.
Yeah, pretty amazing.
Fascinating. I have one question for you. Maybe it'll be our last one for the evening. Do you have a favorite bird?
Favorite?
There's so many.
The cheesy answer that I've seen lots of people give is the one I'm looking at currently. That's not totally true for me. I mean, I definitely have a soft spot for shorebirds. I could pick any number of shorebirds. I did my PhD work on rock sandpipers. They're kind of unloved, unappreciated. So I kind of root for the underdog. Yeah, I like them all. But yeah, rock sandpipers are pretty special.
That's great. I love the personal tie to them. That's
Yeah.
fun. It would be hard not to love them after, I'm sure, spending so much time devoted to them.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, we had one last question come in asking about where the largest mortality occurs. Is it the breeding ground, the wintering ground, or during the migration?
Yeah, that's the $1,000 question. We'd love to study that. And honestly, these radios are getting small enough now that I think we can do that more effectively, that it's really kind of unknown that, for instance, we think that these migrations must be really dangerous. Oh my gosh, they're flying across the whole Pacific Ocean. But the more you think about it, these birds, they know what they're doing. They don't do things that don't work. Some of these things may stop working as well due to climate change or reclamation of habitats, but we would really love to know where these threats are occurring. Like with the bar-tailed godwits, the subspecies whose survival is declining so rapidly, the Minsbrai subspecies that breeds in Russia, we would love to better track them and see where they're dying. All we know is that they're not coming back to Australia. And now we're getting small enough radios that don't affect the survival of the birds. We think that undoubtedly some of the early radios were pretty big and affected the survival of these birds. But the stuff that we're putting out now, they're very, very expensive. So it's hard to put out enough to get a really good insight. But you can imagine you start putting small radios on these birds and they will tell you when they die. When that bird stops moving, it's dead. And so that's a hope. That's actually a study we'd like to do with bar-tailed godwits, is find some rich benefactor who, could buy us 50 of these radios so that we could start to assess where in the annual cycle the mortality is highest, because honestly, we don't know. We know that they have really high overwinter survival where they're studied in New Zealand, for instance, but it's really unusual to have a species that's in just one teeny place, like the bar-tailed godwit. Like Western sandpipers are spread from California to Ecuador. There's no way you could really figure out the survival of those birds during the non-breeding season. But for some of these birds, you really can now by tracking them with radios. So yeah, it's a great question. I wish I had a better answer.
Hope you get your funder that can give you 50 of
Yeah,
the equipment you need.
someday.
Yeah, fingers crossed. Well, we're just going past 8 o'clock. And I thank everyone for throwing out questions. And if there are additional questions later on, Dan, is there a way that people can reach you?
Yeah, I'll put my email in the chat here. The Ruthrauff at usgs.gov. Yeah, happy to answer any questions or follow up with anything if you have more insights or questions. Yeah, I'm always there.
Wonderful, thank you. And thank you for volunteering your time tonight and for just sharing so much. I've had this on my calendar for a while, really looking forward to it. So learned a ton, was really great. Lived up to the expectations. So
thanks for hanging in there with the Wi-Fi problem too.
Oh yeah, of course. I'm glad we got you back, and thank you everyone for your patience as we're just navigating through being human. So thank you very much. Really appreciated it. Yeah, really appreciated it. And for everyone, we will not be back next week for Wildlife Wednesday. We'll be back the following week. And that is because next week we will be at the Kachemak Bay Marine Mammal Forum in Homer, and we'll also be having an option to attend presentations virtually. So it'll kind of be like a 3-day Wildlife Wednesday. So visit our website. I threw the link high up in the chat. You can check out more there. But otherwise, we'll see you in a couple of weeks. And thank you so much again, everyone, for attending. And thank you, Dan.
Yeah, thank you all.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Yep.